Okay, so next we're going to continue on this general topic, and I'd like to introduce Chris Smith. He's at Minnesota DOT. He's a wildlife ecologist in the Office of Environmental Stewardship there, where he coordinates the agency's compliance with federal and state protected species rules and regulations, including the Endangered Species Act. Chris has a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife management and a master's degree in conservation biology, both from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And I've specifically asked Chris to come and provide a DOT perspective, again, on managing threatened and endangered species and what Minnesota DOT is finding is working for them.
Well, thank you for that. I'm excited to be here. This is a really great group of folks. I'm going to talk just a little bit about roads generally and provide a DOT perspective, a MnDOT perspective, touch on a few rare species, talk a little bit about some of the regulations that we interact with and how that might influence our perspective. And then just I want to highlight some best practices that we're using in Minnesota that hopefully some folks here are already using on their work, and if not, you can take those back and consider them. And then just highlight, because we all like to brag, highlight some new initiatives that MnDOT's working on to be proactive in this area. And so first, I run into a lot of folks, and I hope most folks here in the room are pretty familiar with this already, but MnDOT owns only a really small proportion of all the roadways in Minnesota. And so we get a lot of conservation groups approaching us, asking us to do work. We say, you know, oh, where do you want that work to occur? On this and this road. Oh, well, that's not a MnDOT road. That's one of our township roads or county roads. And so it's important to make that distinction that the state DOTs, in most cases, own a really small proportion of the overall roadside that could be potential habitat. And it's also really important to keep in mind that the primary function of these roadsides from a DOT perspective is to protect our transportation infrastructure, so our roads, our bridges, make sure we have adequate drainage to keep these roadways open, and then also safety is a really large component of that as well. If you have a stray vehicle leaving the roadway, we want to make sure that there's an adequate clear zone so those vehicles are not hitting trees and other things like that. And then another really important thing to keep in mind is that these roadsides are required to allow future infrastructure maintenance. And so we buy up right away next to our roads, knowing full well that we're going to go back someday and revisit that site, reconstruct that road, maybe expand that road. And so a lot of times these habitats will be disturbed again. And so that's something to keep in mind. That said, there are many secondary benefits, including things like infiltration of stormwater. Minnesota, being a land of 10,000 lakes, water is really important to us. Aesthetics, we heard a little bit about that earlier. This can reduce driver stress, improve air quality, and certainly last but not least, it can provide really important plant and animal habitat, which is why we're here, and help protect some of our rare plant communities. And these two things are not mutually exclusive, but when you approach a road authority, it's really important to frame habitat restoration and things of that nature into those primary functions. And so we want to talk about planting native species. You want to talk about how those native species have a lot of below ground biomass and roots which help stabilize soils and protect slopes to protect that road infrastructure. Not maybe so much from the approach of creating habitat, but how it's going to benefit the transportation agency. And so there are a lot of opportunities in roadsides, and a lot of road authorities are on board with this idea. We can reconstruct habitat after a project goes in and disturbs soils. We can create corridors. We've heard this a few times today about how corridors are really important for migratory or other highly mobile species. Here I have a map showing the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. It's really easy to sell to our engineers if we have a road inside one of these already identified corridors, like, hey, we should plant natives here. Helps meet multiple purposes. And then there's also opportunity to protect and enhance existing rare features that already occur on our roadsides. Minnesota is fortunate. We have quite a few plants that occur in our roadsides and nowhere else in the state because they've been lost because of land use changes. However, there are quite a few challenges, and one of the things that I'm often asked is, you know, why would we want to create habitat attract rare species to our roadsides, knowing full well we're going to have to go back in and disturb those areas in the future. And the last talk did a really good job of highlighting some of the potential mechanisms to safeguard against this. But because a lot of our projects are federally funded, they do have some sort of federal nexus, some of those agreements can't be used for this purpose. We also have a really large challenge with establishing native vegetation in a roadside. Any of you who do active land management try to establish prairie in a roadside that's dominated by invasive species, cool seasons grasses, that's impacted by vehicles leaving the roadway. It's a really large challenge, and related to that is there's a lack of funding to maintain those sites. You know, we can often get native seeds put down at the end of a project, but it requires a lot more than just spreading seeds out to get that to establish. And you hear a lot about our infrastructure across the country and some of the funding shortfalls we have with maintaining the roads and bridges themselves. Trying to get funds to maintain the roadsides is quite difficult, and so keep that in mind. I'm interested in ideas for how we can overcome some of these challenges. There are also concerns about vegetation height. A lot of our native seed mixes, at least that we use in Minnesota, include things like big blue stem around corners and curves that can affect your sight line. It makes it a little bit more difficult for people to see raccoons or deer that may be approaching the roadway. That's something that's brought up. And then last but certainly not least, and kind of the elephant in the room in my opinion, is this vehicle mortality and roadside management related mortality. There may be some cases where creating habitat may not be what's in the best interest for some of the rare species. There are certainly cases where creating habitat and roadsides is going to have a net conservation benefit, but we need to do our due diligence, really evaluate this on a species by species basis to make sure we're not attracting species to their detriment to these areas. And so just to kind of switch gears a bit, I want to talk a little bit about rare species. Minnesota, this is just real quick a list of rare species or federal listed species that we have. And we have quite a few state listed species as well. That's not what's important in that case, but one of the things that I want to mention is we've heard a lot about pollinators. This group seems really focused on pollinators. Pollinators are a really hot topic right now. They've really been a catalyst for getting a lot of really good discussion and work done. But we do have other species that use our roadsides and our road infrastructure, including things like the northern long-eared bat. This is another species that was recently listed. It's known to roost on bridges and culverts and things like that, occur in forested habitats immediately adjacent to roadways. So it's important to keep that in mind, that, and I think a lot of folks here get it, that it goes way beyond just pollinators. To answer one of the questions that was asked earlier, Fish and Wildlife does have a really nice 7-year work plan that they've released that identifies a whole list of species that are being evaluated for whether or not they warrant listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And there are a few other pollinators on that list. I'm not going to go through this, but I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to look it up. You can Google it and find it. But I do want to highlight a couple additional species of concern that are kind of on our radar from a state DOT perspective. They don't occur across the whole country, but for those of you from the upper Great Lakes, the Great Lakes region in the Northeast, you have these species. And the first species I want to just really briefly touch on is the Blandings turtle. This is a turtle species that in most of the states where it occurs, it is state listed. It's imperiled across most of its range. It is being considered for federal listing. Fish and Wildlife anticipates making that listing decision in fiscal year 23, so we have quite a while to get ahead of this. It's a slow to mature species, so we're going to need a lot of time to really, if we're going to be proactive and do some good conservation work for this species, we'll need that amount of time. Unlike a lot of rare species, roads and railroads have been identified as one of the primary threats to populations. They are, like I said, long-lived. They're slow to reach sexual maturity. A female might not breed and lay eggs until she's 15, 20 years old. She crawls out of a wetland. She is looking for a nesting site. It might be alongside a road. She might try to cross that road. Unfortunately, she might not make it across that road. So you lose that individual from the population, but because they're so long-lived, you also lose decades of reproductive potential. And so there have been quite a few studies looking at population dynamics of these long-lived turtles, and in many cases, losing even just a few individuals a year is unsustainable. That population will no longer be viable over the long term. And so we do, like I said, have a really good opportunity here. Dewatering is also another potential concern, which we'll come back to, that a lot of transportation agencies do. The next species is also a turtle, a wood turtle. A lot of the same concerns, roads, railroads, to a little bit more extent. Habitat loss and degradation. This is a cold water stream species, and so surrounding land use can impact them. But I just wanted to throw these out there in case they're not on your radar. They are being considered for federal listing, and I think road rights-of-way and transportation infrastructure folks have a lot of opportunity here to do some really good proactive work. And then to switch gears yet again, I want to just touch on a few of the regulations that we interact with frequently when we're working on developing and delivering our projects that kind of help form maybe some of the perspective that we have. And so we do, in most cases, there are state ESA, there are state Endangered Species Acts as well that you have to comply with. We do have a lot of species that are state listed in our roadsides already. Here you can see it's one of our state listed milkweeds along one of our busy highways. Also, as was mentioned earlier, we do, a lot of our projects include some sort of federal funding or federal nexus, and so we coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service via what's called Section 7 of the Act, which you've already heard a little bit about. In many cases, states are delegated partial authority from the Federal Highway Administration to do that consultation themselves. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about this process, AASHTO, which is one of the transportation groups, put together a really nice handbook. I encourage you to look it up. It kind of distills down some of the basic steps involved in that process. And just to kind of provide a little bit of perspective, and so within that Section 7 process, and this is an oversimplification by quite a lot, there are generally speaking 3 effect determinations that we can make on a project, one of which being no effect, and this is what we strive for. We want to make sure our projects are having no impact. And a lot of our projects do meet this no effect category. A lot of our projects for pollinators are concerned. They're non-native grass dominated roadsides, they're not suitable habitat, and so if we in turn plant a lot of native species, it might bump a project from a no effect to a not likely to adversely affect category, which adds a fair bit of workload to both us as an action agency, as well as we have to get in writing a response from Fish and Wildlife, so it adds some workload to them as well. Taking it one step even further, if you have really good habitat and you have rare species in your roadside, and you expect that action to result in take of those rare species, you have to go through what's referred to as formal consultation. This takes many months. It's quite a large undertaking. And so this is, when I say, do we really want to plant native stuff on our roadside? Personally, I say yes, but this is kind of getting at some of the workload challenges that we face when creating habitat and attracting roadside or wildlife to our roadsides to be aware of. And so I know MnDOT's really interested in candidate conservation agreements, safe harbor agreements. I look forward to speaking with some of the folks more about that. I think that's a great tool in the toolbox. But you will run into this when you speak with different transportation folks. And then just real quick, I want to highlight a few best practices that we use in Minnesota, and hopefully, like I said, you're already using, and if not, I encourage you to take them back to your organizations. We have at MnDOT, we're fortunate we have a DOT DNR liaison, and he's been in the position for quite a few years. He's developed this best practices manual for transportation projects, and includes things like using native seed mixes, which we're all here very familiar with, but also includes quite a few other things that are important for maintaining good habitat in our roadsides, including like using wildlife-friendly erosion control materials after projects. So this little square plastic mesh that you often see used in roadsides is known to entangle snakes and other small critters that are crawling through the roadsides. When it's mowed up and blows into wetlands, it can also entangle fishes. So be aware of that. There are plenty of other alternatives, one of which was mentioned earlier was the hydro mulch or hydro seeding. In Minnesota, we've actually prohibited the use of certain dyes that are really toxic to aquatic life. And so malachite green is a really common dye used in that hydro seeding that we no longer allow. I know for a fact that a lot of other DOTs still do allow it on their projects. And so that's something you might look into. We can provide you with some of the documents that we've created supporting our decision to not allow that product on our construction projects. Another one which was new to me when I started at the DOT, which I think is really cool, is what's called a wildlife passage bench. And this is basically an idea of underneath a bridge, you have all this big riprap. And if you've ever walked underneath a bridge, it's really difficult. You can get your ankle stuck in the cracks and crevices. And the wildlife have the same challenge. And so Peter came up with this idea of making a small flat spot using smaller aggregate or even sand to essentially make a path to allow critters to move underneath the bridges along streams. And it's worked surprisingly well. Here you can see in the photo, let's see if this works. There's a little path right here on this side. And even without fencing to direct wildlife to use these, deer, raccoons, coyote, fox, all sorts of critters are finding these. And it's a really minor change that's making a really big difference. And so I encourage you, if you're not already doing that in your states, to consider doing so. Wildlife-friendly curb and gutter is another one that I think presents a huge opportunity to road authorities. And this, again, is getting back at turtles and other small critters that may cross the road. You wouldn't think that a 4 to 6 inch barrier curb would be a significant obstacle to a turtle, but to be honest, they're not always the smartest critters out there. And they hit that curb, instead of going up and over, they actually kind of push their way along the edge, looking for a path of less resistance. And in doing so, you prolong the amount of time that they're on the road. They may even ping pong back and forth, and so you increase the probability that they're going to be struck by a vehicle. And so including sloped curbs, or in some cases, this is a Minnesota project, we included a sloped curb cut every 50 feet on a project, so that if small animals entered the roadway, they can more easily get out of that roadway. So again, a relatively simple solution to a pretty significant conservation challenge. Back to the riprap real quick, vegetated riprap. So again, you know that you can get your small critters, turtles, ducklings, and things like that can get caught in this. So we're using, in some cases, vegetated a hydro mulch material to vegetate our riprap so that you can get vegetation going over it. You can get critters using it, walking over it more easily. In some cases, we're also using sand to create nesting habitat for turtles and other species that depend on those open sand habitats. Dewatering, I mentioned earlier, a lot of DOTs do this when they need to maintain or reconstruct some of their water control structures. Oftentimes, at least up where I'm from, this is done in the wintertime when you have frozen ground. It's easiest to get machinery in there. But for some of these rare species that are overwintering in these wetlands, it happens to be the exact worst time to do that work. And we actually have an example of Minnesota where we came really close to losing a lot of Blandings turtles because there was a ditch, and DNR had tracked a bunch of turtles overwintering to this ditch, and fortunately there was good communication with the road authority in that area because they were going to do a ditch clean out in the middle of winter, and they would have wiped out literally a very significant proportion of the population. And so that was caught before it happened, but be aware that if you're working in areas where you're dewatering for whatever reason, if you have rare, especially amphibians and reptiles that overwinter at the bottom of these ponds and other wetlands, be aware that you may want to tweak your activities there. And then just lastly, as far as best practices go, I want to mention this oversized culvert. So we have tons of culverts out there on our road infrastructure. A lot of them are really small. They serve a hydrological function. But if we increase the size of those, we will get critters using those to get underneath the road more safely. If we compare it with some fencing, we'll do even better. But here's an example we use in Minnesota where we pair box culverts. You have one that serves as the channel for the stream during ordinary flows. During high water, it can flow through both. But during the ordinary flow, there's enough land here that critters can find that and pass underneath the road without being struck by a vehicle. And so just real quick, I want to throw out a few initiatives that I think will interest some of the folks in this room, one of which is we're doing a lot of bat surveys in Minnesota on our bridges. We have both our bridge inspectors who do our routine bridge inspection, checking for bats, as well as our biological staff. We've also recently developed technical memo, basically internal policy to change the way we do tree clearing on our projects. We've shifted a lot of our tree clearing to the wintertime to avoid and minimize impacts to bats as well as migratory birds. Also getting in preparation for the removal of the 4D rule. We anticipate that will go at some point and that some of the requirements for tree removal will be a little bit more strict. We're also funding a 2-year Bumblebee project that will survey areas in the Twin Cities metro area. This is being contracted out to the University of Minnesota. We plan on doing a bunch of rapid surveys as well as some population monitoring and looking at both the rusty patch bumblebee as well as some of the other imperiled bumblebees that are on the radar for potential future listings. To kind of get at the turtle question, there's been a lot of fencing designs used both in Minnesota and beyond for keeping turtles off the road. We tried to pull from kind of the best of those and make a standardized design. And so we've recently received some funding to actually install our standard design, which modifies our existing right-of-way fencing specifications to see if it's effective. And so stay tuned. We'll be doing that here in the coming few years. We're most likely going to be working with the Minnesota Zoo, who has a good turtle biologist to help with that. Here's an example of some of that fencing that was installed, just kind of on a project-by-project basis to keep turtles off the busy road. We also are seeking money, and we're hopefully going to have approval for a grant to increase our prescribed fire program on our roadsides to improve habitat. We do as much prescribed fire as we can, but we're really limited by the number of burn bosses we have. And then last, but certainly not least, we have recently developed a sustainability plan for MnDOT, and in that plan we've identified the need to significantly increase the amount of native seed mixes we're using on our roadsides. And so with that, I hopefully have some time for questions.
Yes, I work for the Michigan Department of Transportation, and a couple of the BMPs you mentioned there, specifically the oversized culverts. I've noticed that that's a BMP that is a very easy sell to both our design engineers and our construction engineers. It doesn't really increase costs that much, and plus it does provide extra protection for catastrophic flooding events, which are becoming more and more common. And also with the tree cutting for the northern long-eared bat, I work with our maintenance staff a lot, and I'm basically the bearer of bad news. I'm the one that always tells them what they can't do. And we've been going with that 4D cutting restriction for several years now, and everybody's pretty used to it. But I just got a call the other day where a different entity is cutting trees within the restricted period, and they always call me and say, they're doing it, why can't we? And the answer is, we don't do it. I was just curious if you get similar comments or calls from questions from your maintenance staff.
Yeah, I haven't had that particular question. I do get a lot of questions about why am I, from central office, being more restrictive than what's in the 4D rule, because we are being more restrictive. And my answer to that is that we're trying to move a big, large agency, all their practices closer to what's in the programmatic agreement, which we expect we'll have to use in the future. And it's tough to have a project where they're halfway through construction and the rules change, and tree removal can't happen anymore for whatever reason. And so we're trying to get out ahead of that. And so do more of our tree removal in the wintertime. It has added benefits. It helps reduce soil disturbance and helps reduce spreading tree diseases and things like that.
Yeah, we're actually, for our construction projects, we're letting, excuse me, the tree removals separately, yep, to get them done during the winter. But as you mentioned, I got a project a couple of years back where there were still some trees that needed to remove after March 31st, and we had to get into that formal consultation, and it took a long time, and we finally were able to remove those trees. But it was a lesson learned to our construction staff that it's in their best interest to get those trees removed during that period of time when, yeah, it's allowed.
And we've had a few situations like that. I mean, we've been pretty fortunate. We work really well and really closely with our field office, and when we've had a few extra trees pop up that weren't originally part of the plans, we've been able to work through that relatively easy. But yeah, I mean, planning ahead, all of our projects are planned years and years ahead of time. There's no reason why we can't build in either a separate contract to do tree removal or adjust the letting of the project to accommodate winter tree removal. So that's the direction we're headed.
Thank you.
I'm also interested in your culvert information, which is in your best management practices manual, right?
Yep.
Because we have situations where roads are being built and the culverts, why the suggestion is a large enough culvert, if it's backing up into a sensitive wetland and actually inundating the wetland and destroying some of the value of that wetland, this would be a very good practice. So I'm with interest going to look up your manual for this.
And Peter Lee, like I said, he's our DNR DOT liaison. Yeah. This is really one of his efforts that he's led, and there's been some successes and failures of doing this, and so I would encourage you to reach out to Peter and dig into some of those details. The one thing that I will add, though, especially for like turtles, if that's one of your objectives here, you really do need to pair this with a fence to direct the turtles to that underpass, essentially. Otherwise, they're pretty unlikely to find it. Some of the mammals seem to find it on their own.
And this is actually in Blanding Turtle's territory. That. Okay, thank you.
As long as we're focused on that picture, do you see that additional box culvert being used as by deer to stay off the road?
That's a good question. I have to ask Peter if he's documented deer using it. I know those passes benches underneath bridges get used by a lot of deer, and he has lots of photos, but I'm not sure about this specific case.
This is almost the Canadian moose model of, because deer follow water, and that's where you always hit them on the road.
They do, as long as that culvert's big enough. I mean,
it's big, really if it's big enough like that. I'd be intrigued to know if you've seen any data on deer kills in relation to this.
If you get a hold of me, I can look into that for you.
I guess a semi-related question to that is how do you account for interactions with different species in these interventions? I'm thinking, for example, like the turtle fences. How does that impact deer or other mammals that are trying to cross the road? I guess what I'm getting at is how do we account for what's best for all species if an intervention, if creating habitat on a road is okay for one species, but more sensitive species it might not be good for. How do you weigh one species against another and how the interventions sort of interact between all of the species?
I wish I knew, but to attempt to answer that, I mean, the fencing that we've used for turtles is short enough that a deer can easily jump over it. Raccoons can climb over it, things like that. It's not usually a barrier to those larger species. From as far as like how do you pick and choose which is your priority, personally I try to look at the biology of the species. Losing one turtle to road mortality, depending on the size of the population, can actually have population level impacts versus not having butterfly habitat in that one little spot. I mean, that's not a good comparison, because in the case of fencing, you can have pollinator habitat and keep turtles off the road at the same time. But we try to look at the biology and kind of see, where you're going to have the bigger bang for your buck as far as the conservation for the different species that are of concern. But it's a balancing act, and it's tough. So it's not a good silver bullet there. I don't know if that answered your question, but
on your benches that you guys are doing underneath the bridges, you said that you use a rather fine aggregate such as sand. How long have you been utilizing those, and are you seeing scour or erosion along those areas? Yes, not having a stable. I mean, the reason why we put riprap there is it's stable, right? So
some years it does disappear, but then oftentimes the next flood that comes through, it actually fills back up, and so it starts to kind of maintain. It's not usually sand, it's usually a smaller aggregate, a smaller gravel, just so it's not one of those big rocks that deer can't walk over, raccoons, people, and things like that. So, but we do. When we have some bridges where it just doesn't work every year, it gets washed out and never comes back. But in a lot of cases, it might get shifted around during high water, but it refills back in itself. So. Yep.
Chris, can you elaborate a little bit about your efforts to manage the mowing of various ditches and how successful you've been?
No comment. We can talk later about that.